The Chicken Asylum, an Alex Reynolds mystery. Author, Fred Hunter. Publisher, St. Martin's, Griffin, New York. Narrator, Eric Aust. Chapter 6. "Peter!" I yelled. "Peter, where are you?" "Over here." His voice came from behind an overturned table, about 3 feet from the doorway. His tone had that look, "What you've gotten us into now," tinge to it. I was going to have to speak to him about that again. He rolled the table aside and added, "I'm all right." Bob had gotten up and, brushing the loose glass from his clothes, suddenly looked up and said, "Where's James? Where is he?" "He went that way," Peter said, motioning to the doorway. "Stay here," Bob commanded as he set off after him. "Wait a minute," I cried, jumping to my feet. "Don't you—" "I'm FBI, you idiot," he called over his shoulder as he disappeared. I dropped my hands to my sides and sighed disgustedly. Of course you are." Then I went over to Peter and helped him up. "You sure you're all right?" "Oh, I'm just dandy." The colored lights were still cascading around the room, sparkling off the shards of glass and rippling across the body of the dead stranger. The music continued to pulsate, echoing hollowly in the empty room. "Well, that's the fastest we've ever cleared out a bar," I said. "What the hell happened to James?" Peter started to brush off his pants. "When the shooting started, I yelled run, and he took off. I wasn't as quick. I dove behind the table." The music shifted from one song to the next, and during the momentary lull, we heard a groan from behind the bar. We ran back there and found Ernie sitting with his back uncomfortably propped against a row of bottles. His hand was pressed against his right temple, and a thin stream of blood ran from beneath it. "Ernie," I said, "you're hurt." "No shit," he replied, slewing his eyes at me. "Turn that fucking music off, will you?" The receiver was on a shelf about 4 feet above his head. Peter leaned over and pressed the power button, and a blissful silence fell on the place. "Was shot?" I asked anxiously. "No. That bastard just cracked me on the head." He removed his hand from his temple and looked at his palm, then let out a satisfied grunt. Apparently, he thought there was enough blood to warrant the pain. The gash in his head wasn't deep, but it was impressive in its ugliness. Peter climbed around us to Ernie's other side, and we each grabbed one of his arms, hauling him up. "What happened?" I asked. "What made you grab that guy?" "He had a gun," said Ernie. "I didn't see one. I just saw a flash of it for a second. I've had all kinds of things happen in here. I keep my eyes open. I didn't like the way he was talking to that friend of yours, so I watched him. When he started for the bathroom, his coat opened a little, and I saw it, the gun." "God, you sure took a chance," Peter said with admiration. "I wasn't gonna let him hurt that kid, and he looked like he was walking him off to an execution. Only thing is, when I pulled him up on the bar, he nailed me with a beer bottle. Did he get away?" "James?" "No, the motherfucker with a gun." "Oh, no. He's over there on the dance floor," I said. "Only he's not dancing." Ernie looked over to where I was pointing, and instead of the shock I expected, he looked angry. "Aw, shit, a shooting? Did you know how much trouble that's going to cause?" "We have a pretty good idea," said Peter. Ernie put a palm back to his head, and with his other hand switched off the colored lights and turned on the work lights. It was then that we saw Agent Nelson. He was standing by the door. "It looks like you had some excitement," he said. "What happened?" "The gunfight at Charlene's Corral," I intoned. "Where's James?" "You see those bullet holes over by that doorway? He went that-a-way, and your partner went after him." "Fredericks is not my partner," Nelson replied with his usual lack of emotion. He looked down at the dead man. "And this? I assume that belongs to you, too." Nelson glanced down at the prostrate gunman. "I don't know this one." "What the fuck is going on?" Ernie said from behind his palm. "Good question," said Peter, who looked as irritated as he usually does when he's been shot at. We could already hear sirens approaching. Nelson ignored Ernie's question. I'll handle the police. Your friend, Frank O'Neill, is still a commander, isn't he? Yes, I replied. Frank was an ex-boyfriend of Mother's, and he had remained smitten long after the thrill was gone, a fact that had helped us out on the numerous occasions we'd found ourselves in a spot of trouble, which was a very mild way of describing our current situation. Nelson knelt by the body and went through its pockets in a quick and efficient manner, but found nothing. While he was doing this, Bob, who I would now have to think of as Agent Fredericks, returned through the hallway. He got away, he said to Nelson without preamble. Through a window in the bathroom, out the side of the building. I couldn't find him. He got away thanks to this guy of yours. Really? Nelson said, rising for the second time since this affair had begun. I got the feeling he was trying not to smile. He knocked me over, Frederick said angrily. You pulled a gun, I exclaimed. How the hell was I supposed to know you were an agent? I was trying to save James. And endangering everybody else. If you were trying to save him, why did you follow them to the back where there were fewer people? He jerked his thumb at Ernie. Because Rambo here jumped him. He went for his gun. If you hadn't interfered, if I hadn't stopped you, you would have had a shootout in the middle of the crowd, he replied with a snort. I had heard the term acceptable losses applied to government covert activities where innocent lives may be lost, from Frederick's contemptuous tone, and a feeling the term was relative when it came to the patrons of Charlene's. Gentlemen, Nelson said with a glance at Ernie, I think we should continue this later. Nelson sought to expedite matters by calling Frank on his cell phone. He asked me for the number, and I was all too happy to supply it, figuring we could use all the help we could get, and Nelson was right to do it, because the first cops to arrive on the scene were a pair of uniformed officers, closely followed by another pair, all of whom greeted Nelson's announcement of being with the CIA with the blank-faced skepticism that the lower ranks sometimes fall into when faced with a situation where they know they're out of their depth. They clearly thought he was trying to put something over on them, and stared at his ID as if they suspected he'd had it knocked up at a novelty shop. But Nelson's bearing makes him a hard person to doubt, especially when he told them that Commander Frank O'Neill was on the way, so they focused their attention on Ernie, with whom they already seemed familiar. When Frank arrived about 15 minutes later, he looked anything but happy. His square jaw was slightly askew as he approached us. Just once, he said, just once I'd like to see you guys when you're not standing over a dead body. It's not my fault this time, I said, tilting my head slightly in Peter's direction. I can guess who's responsible, Frank replied, eyeing Nelson with displeasure. I'm not sure if his resentment toward Nelson was because he blamed Nelson for continually getting us into danger, or because he would be jealous of any reasonably attractive man who comes within pecking distance of Mother. Or maybe it's just the natural animosity of the police for federal agents. Commander, thank you for getting here so quickly. Now, let me fill you in, Nelson said, putting a hand on Frank's arm and smoothly guiding him away from us. I'd love to hear explanations, I whispered to Peter. Why? He's probably telling Frank less than we know. Well, that's going to change soon, I said with determination. It was almost 2 hours before we got home, escorted by Nelson and followed by Fredericks. Mother greeted us with a narrowed glare that gave me the feeling she already knew something was terribly wrong. And of course, the fact that we were there with 2 agents and without James was probably a dead giveaway. Where's James? She demanded as she closed the door after us. He escaped, said Fredericks. Thanks to your son. She eyed him coldly. And you are Agent Robert Fredericks, FBI. She turned to Nelson with a raised eyebrow. The 2 agencies working together. This must be worse than I thought. It is worse than we thought. We were shot at. What? And by the way, I said to Peter, remember when you said that we probably wouldn't get shot at for getting involved in this? He folded his arms across his chest. You just used up the number of times you get to say I told you so on this case, all right? Okay, I said sheepishly. It's not often he takes that tone with me, so I know it means I'm pushing the limit. You said this nonsense wouldn't be dangerous, Mother said to Nelson. I didn't think it would be, he replied placidly. And now James is lost. Lost, Frederick exclaimed. Huh! He escaped. He ran away. Of course he ran away, I said loudly. Somebody was shooting at him. And while we're on the subject, what do you mean by he escaped? He wasn't a prisoner, said Mother sharply. That effectively burst the blustering FBI agent's bubble. Nelson was the one to break the silence that followed. I believe what Agent Fredericks means is that we don't know where James has gone. But you must have some idea, said Mother. None at all, she sighed. Larry, you must know who James called last night. How would he know that? I asked. The records for the payphone, Nelson replied. But we only told you about that this morning. He merely looked at me without saying a word. It was several seconds before it dawned on me. Oh, of course. You already knew about the call last night from your pal Bob. Something else hit me. Something I liked even less. I turned to Fredericks. By the way, are you really a faggot or do you just play one on TV? I've been doing my job, he spat back, red-faced. I looked to Nelson. Oh, he's an agent, all right. Is there nothing you people wouldn't do? When you went into the bar last night, Agent Fredericks followed. We wanted to keep an eye on you. Bob here kept more than an eye on James. I turned to Fredericks. What was that you were doing on the dance floor? A full body search? I was doing my job, he replied through gritted teeth. You enjoying your job? Alex, please, said Mother. We have more important things to talk about than this, Nelson said. Frederick's head snapped in Nelson's direction. Apparently, he felt Nelson was giving some veiled credence to what I was implying. Such as, I asked. We need to figure out where James has gone. Mother bristled. How would we know? You spent 3 evenings with him. Has he ever said anything that would give us an indication at where he might have gone? Like what? Peter asked. Like mentioning knowing someone or someplace here. Other than the cousin he said he called, no, I said. And the only time he mentioned any locations was his first night here. He said he heard about New York and California. That doesn't give us much to go on. Why do you need anything to go on, I said. You have the phone records, you know who James called, so you really haven't lost him. He'll probably go to wherever it was, won't he? I doubt that very much, Nelson said. Why? Oh, Christ, said Peter, slapping his forehead. What is it? That phone call, Nelson explained, resulted in someone being sent to kill him. Larry, I think it's time you explain to us what this is really all about. Don't you? Mother said sternly. It doesn't have anything to do with chemical weapons, does it? If we may sit down, he said. Mother sighed and motioned Nelson and Fredericks to the couch. The 3 of us then pulled up chairs opposite them from a very tense little caucus. It does have something to do with chemical weapons, said Nelson. Peripherally. What I told you was true. James did approach the UN team, and he did make the officer that I told you about. But there's much more to it than that, said Peter. There was a beat before Nelson continued. There was information that we previously believed you didn't need to know. Nelson? We were just in a shootout, I said hotly. We didn't believe the information was relevant to your participation in the matter. Now, of course, things have changed. I don't see that anything's changed, Fredericks protested. They still don't need to know. Nelson didn't even glance at him. So, what is it? Who is James? I asked. Everything I told you at the outset is true. What I didn't tell you was that James was known to us before he approached the team about defecting. Peter was already shaking his head. I know I'm not going to like this. We knew of him because he was a connection, not a very clear one, to a certain splinter group that we're interested in. A splinter group, Peter said flatly. A group called the Jihad Ahmad, otherwise now as the Red Jihad. My mouth fell open. Jihad? Jihad? Are you telling us it's a terrorist group? Yes. I was on my feet in a flash. James is a terrorist. You had us babysitting a terrorist. Please, Nelson said calmly with a single wave of my chair. I dropped back onto it, but could feel steam coming from my ears. Peter was sitting beside me with his arms still folded and his lips flat, glaring at the agents with disdain. Mother looked curiously unmoved by this revelation. She was next to speak. I take it that you're unsure of exactly what James is. He could be exactly what he says, a young man who, because of his sexuality, wanted to defect. But he has relatives and friends who are known members of the Red Jihad. It's a connection, but we don't know how strong of one. You don't know, I echoed with my mouth still gaping. No, Fredericks piped up. This is covert information we're talking about. It's not like they're listed in the phone book under terrorists. Well, if he might be a terrorist, why would you let him into this country? We have no concrete information that he is an active member of the Jihad, Nelson replied. But still, nor did we know why one of its members would want to come here. But you don't know that he's... Nelson cut me off again. We know that James does have a cousin who is definitely a member of the Red Jihad. From our information, this cousin disappeared from Iraq several months ago. We suspect that he's come here, but we haven't been able to trace him. When James approached us about coming here, his motives may have been entirely innocent, but the fact that he has a clear, close relative in the Jihad made his request both welcome and suspect. Well, then why? I broke off again. Nelson stared at me impassively. I helplessly looked at Peter, whose jaw had squared and was set so hard I thought his teeth would crack. You wanted him to come here, didn't you? He said. We wanted to identify any of the Red Jihad that may be here, and know if they were planning anything. But you don't even know if James is actually a member, I said. That's not the point, is it? Said Peter, without removing his eyes from Nelson. What do you mean? I asked. Finding out if James is a member of this crackpot organization of yours. That's not what really matters. It's his connections. What? I still wasn't getting it. He turned to me. They know that he knows people in the group, and they wanted to find out who he would contact once he was here. It was a fishing expedition. You were using him, I said in disbelief, although why I would find this any harder to believe than anything else the government has done in our own direct experience is beyond me. It's important that we find that out, Frederick said defensively. He certainly had none of Nelson's stoicism. If they're here, there can only be one reason. We have information that the Red Jihad may be planning a series of attacks in the U.S., but we don't know who they are or what they plan to do. It's imperative that we find them. You never did think he knew anything about chemical weapons, did you? Mother said accusingly. It was a possibility, Nelson replied with a shrug. If he didn't think that he knew, why go through all this debriefing business? We had to go through the motions. He had to think we believed him. Frederick said, his tone implying we were fools for not realizing this. But why the elaborate charade, said Mother. He wanted Asylum. Why not simply tell him that you would give him that in exchange for information about this jihad? Assuming honesty is not completely foreign to you. He's not an idiot, said Frederick. He knows that betraying them would be to sign his death warrant. Mother's spine stiffened. It would appear that tricking him into betraying them has the same effect. I rose, shaking my head. I don't believe this. A terrorist group. And you told us this wouldn't be dangerous. I had no reason to believe it would be, said Nelson. I screwed my face up. For Christ's sake, Nelson, the Red Jihad even sounds threatening. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his thighs. Alex, we planned to have him here for 3 days. In a few months, he would have been totally free of contact with the government. He would have? Peter broke in skeptically. Theoretically, Nelson replied after a telling pause. He looked back to me. Since he was staring into the face of freedom, we doubted very much that he would make any move so soon. There was no need for him to do that, we know of, and the fact that he did make a move so soon is suggestive in itself. Wait a minute, I said to Fredericks. You went back there while James was making his call. Didn't you hear what he said? The only place I could listen was from inside the John. I went in and stayed by the door, but there was too much noise. I couldn't hear him. You didn't try very hard. You came out before he got off the phone. It wasn't the type of John where you could loiter without calling attention to yourself, he said defensively. I would think you would like that kind of attention. Look, you. Don't bother, I said, then turned on Nelson. Did you ever take into consideration the potential danger you were putting us in? As I said, we didn't think there'd be any danger in this part of the process. I fully believed that his 3 days here would be... His voice trailed off as he searched for the right words. Just part of the sham, said Mother. I was going to say uneventful, and a necessary delay, but we've had some watching your house ever since James has been here, and following you when you took him out. I never believed there was any danger. There was no reason for James to harm you. But why do you want him with us in the first place, as opposed to with someone more experienced? I asked. For the reason I gave you at the outset. I swear to God, I could feel him thinking, I haven't lied to you. I wish he'd say it out loud. As angry as I was, I would have loved to debate whether or not lying and failing to tell the truth were the same thing. Peter said, Well, why didn't you tell us all of this to begin with? Because you didn't really need to know. There didn't seem any sense in worrying you needlessly. Worrying us, Mother said. Why would having a terrorist around the house worry us? We're entertaining far worse than that. Nelson allowed enough of a pause to let her know he'd gotten her meaning. As he rose, he said, Now that you've been filled in, we'll be going. Just a minute, I said. What about that guy that tried to kill James? Who was he? We don't know. What will you do now that James disappeared? Mother asked. Find him, Frederick said grimly. I think it's clear now that he's a member of the Red Jihad. We might not have known it before, but we know it now. How on earth do you figure that? Mother asked incredulously. Didn't they just try to kill him? That's right, he said, nodding his head significantly. They did. Well, why else do you think they would try to kill him? A call to this so-called cousin of his is answered by a hitman. They wouldn't do that for nothing. They have to think he's betrayed them somehow. Why would they think that? Said Peter. Even James doesn't know why he's really here. Who the hell knows? Maybe he's done something else to piss them off. It's easy enough to do. To get a death warrant so fast, he has to be one of them. One thing we know is he ran away. If he wanted protection from them, he could have come to us. He ran because he was being shot at. He's already seen the kind of protection you can give him, I said. Do you feel that way? Mother said to Nelson. My attitude is more wait to see. Of course, our first priority is to find James. We'll be searching for him along with Frederick's people. I've already talked to your friend, Commander O'Neill. So the police are looking for him as well. All the bases will be covered. So you're looking for him, and the police are looking for him. What about these Red Jihad fellows? Red Jihad fellows is one of those phrases that simply has to be heard with a British accent to be believed. Oh, what about them? Frederick snapped. Won't they be looking for him? I don't know, said Nelson. I just wondered because if they are, mightn't they come here? I don't think that would happen, said Nelson. Since James told whoever he called to meet him at the bar, I think it's unlikely that he told them where he was staying. But I do intend to keep your house under surveillance for a while, just in case. Exactly what kind of a surveillance? Mother asked, her forehead creased with concern. We'll have a man in a car out front, and one out back. I see. Well, it's a comfort to know that, at least. Peter and I exchanged glances, and he looked as perplexed as I was. It wasn't like Mother to express concern to Nelson about our safety, especially with so much sincerity. The agents took their leave of us, and although they left practically side by side, Nelson managed to keep himself aloof from Fredericks, almost as if he were encased in one of those impenetrable blisters that protected the Martian spaceships in the War of the Worlds. As Mother closed the door after them, I asked, Are you really that worried that those guys will come here? The Red Jihad, she replied incredulously. Of course not. She started back toward the kitchen, and Peter and I trailed after her. Then why were you so concerned about having someone watch the house? I just wanted to know if they were doing it. He didn't tell us before that they were watching the house, and I simply had to know if they were still planning to do it. She'd reached the far end of the kitchen and went directly to the door at the back of the pantry. Where are you going? I asked with surprise. To the basement. Why? She pushed open the door, glanced over her shoulder, and said, Come ahead. We followed her down the wooden stairs, and I was surprised to find she'd left the lights on down there. I was even more surprised that the tiny black and white television set we normally kept in the kitchen was sitting on the dryer, the picture flickering and the sound turned off. The set was facing an old couch. We'd long since retired to a corner of the basement. The room appeared to be empty. Were you watching television down here? I asked, completely perplexed. Of course not, she said. Then she called out, You can come out now, we're alone. There was a long pause, and someone very tentatively peeked out from behind the couch. It was James. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.